Good morning. Thanks for coming. This panel, we're going to talk about doing more with less, which appears to be sort of a mantra for the Trump administration. They've talked about trimming the fat and making government more efficient. So I want to start off by asking each of you to tell me what that means at each of your agencies. When you hear do more with less, what are you thinking about?
Sure, so I can go ahead and get started. My name is Robert Werman. I'm with Unified Shared Services Management at GSA. And our charge is essentially to look across government for the opportunities to improve largely the mission support functions, but across what I would consider this sort of interconnected fabric of what we see in federal technology, starting with the administrative services and systems, which is the federal financial management, human capital, contract writing, grants management, and so forth, and the technologies and systems and services that support that, which is a multi-billion-dollar a year spend. And then, of course, you then sort of bleed over in that fabric to the core IT with networks and email and collaboration and instant messaging and the mobile devices, over into the mission space where you have the more customized, tailored mission technologies that support the agencies and what they're charged to do for the American people. So in Unified Shared Services Management, we're beginning with that administrative services stack and understanding where the opportunities are to figure out what's common in the way agencies do that work. And that's really important work, right? It's obviously, a lot of that is related to managing the money of the agencies, recruiting and developing the workforce that performs the mission, engaging with industry on procurements to scale up and get capabilities that the agencies don't inherently have in and of themselves, and looking to industry for those capabilities and that scaling. And so there's a lot of opportunity in the technology and the services in that space to modernize, because historically, a lot of these technologies have been built up individually from one agency to the next, largely as a function of the limitations on the technology themselves. But as we know now with cloud and the capabilities that we see in SaaS and infrastructure as a service, there's some really great opportunities that I'm going to talk a little bit about later on in this panel that Unified Shared Services Management is exploring with agencies to drive efficiency, improve cost savings and capabilities in the federal mission support space.
My turn?
Sure.
Okay. So I've been working with and in the federal government for 41 years. I've been doing more with less for 41 years. So I'd like to first of all, I'm Rod Turk. I'm the acting CIO at the Department of Commerce, just so we can let you know who I am. If I'd have known there was going to be no table here, I'd have worn my Washington Nationals socks. Just because after they won last night over the Cubs. But anyway, doing more with less, what that really means to me is being more efficient and doing the smart things, right? So I look across the Department of Commerce enterprise, and I'm looking at places where I can do the right thing and to make the changes that's going to make me more efficient and save money. Now, I found it interesting on those charts up there from our previous speaker that it said something to the effect that 24%, that the savings was actually 24% based upon what their experience is. And of that, 40% then you get to plow back into the organization. I would submit that if it's only 40%, really that actually should be higher. But the point here is that we're talking about cost savings. I look across the Department of Commerce enterprise, right? And I'm looking at where I've got duplicative services, where I've got duplicative kinds of things in my organization that would benefit from bringing that particular service to Unity. So what do I mean by that? I'm looking at, first of all, within the HCHP complex, which is the Hoover building where I live, why do I have 4 security operations centers in the building? Why do I have 4? Why don't I have 1? Why don't I take all 4 of those feeds from all of those security operations centers and send them to my enterprise security operations center in Fairmont, West Virginia? It is intuitive that you ought to be able to save some money, be more efficient, have a greater center of excellence in one place rather than 4, and get the job done better. So when I look at doing more with less, I'm looking at being more efficient. I'm looking at moving quickly, because time is money, and I'm looking at being, actually giving a better product and a better solution for my customers, so that I can take that money, because all of us here, I'm sure, and I'm sure every CIO you talk to has a list of things that they want to do, a list of things that they can't do because they don't have the coin to be able to do it, or the resources to be able to do it. And the idea then is to be able to be more efficient in those areas you can, take those resources, take the money, the people, and move them into areas where you can actually make a difference in areas that you are not currently making a difference. That's doing more with less.
So what they said. No, but and those are great answers. I think the more interesting part is, and I'm Jonathan Albaum, I work at USDA. USDA does a whole range of things, just like Commerce. From fighting forest fires at USDA to writing nutrition policy, we touch Americans every day, and in ways that people don't even realize sometimes, right? So it's very important that we use our money as efficiently as possible. And as Rod was saying, we duplicate a lot. I think the more interesting question is to say, well, why do we duplicate these things, and how do we change the culture across government and the mindset that it's okay to have one security operations center, and that Commerce, the central office, or USDA central office could service these sometimes very powerful component agencies that have really important missions that make everyone's life better. But they feel such a tie to that work and the supporting functions around it, and they have the money, as we were discussing with Representative Kelly before, that sometimes it's very hard to make that change. So if we really want to do more with less, it's more than FITARA, it's more than a memo from OMB. It's fundamentally changing the way we think about how government is funded, I think, and how money gets used in organizations. So these good ideas that we all have, and it's USSM just on a agency level, and then bring it up a higher level as what you're describing in terms of government-wide. So we don't think the money's very is our money. It's always taxpayer money, but we think about it as our agency or our requirement. So we have to be thinking about how we change mindsets, and to me, that's the most important thing that we might be able to get out of this administration. Some fundamental change in how we think about the money and how we spend it to do these very similar activities, and leave the very mission-focused core responsibilities of an agency. Have the agency focus on that as opposed to all these ancillary things.
So I'm curious if you can walk us through what that might look like. What would it take for agencies to change the way they're doing buying and to actually think about some of these problems like duplication?
Yeah, so thank you. So at USDA, we have a CIO Council, and we work routinely with that council on enterprise ideas. And we're getting more traction now because we've been working at this for many years to, one, build trust with our agency CIOs, and also to help them understand that the services we offer are as good or sometimes better, very similar to the services they can provide for themselves. So it looks like, from my perspective, it looks like spending a lot of time on building trust and rapport and things that are necessary in any set of relationships that you have anywhere in your life for people to trust you and want to work together. You see it in business all the time. We need to do that internally and recognize that it's very simplistic to say, I'm going to write a memo that says you're going to centralize this thing, or you're going to run it in one place and everyone's going to do it. It's just not how we react, at least in our organization. We're very much focused on consensus and building together things. People don't want to be cut out of defining the solution. And I think if we think about we, and we don't think about the CIO, or we think about one office, we get a lot further. So that mentality, combined with supporting memos and direction from OMB or Congress or others, that's what creates the opportunity to be successful. I'm very optimistic about our chances at USDA because we've done this foundational work in terms of creating, building trust. We're not there yet. There's always more to do, more you can build. But we have a foundation, and if we have the right external pushes, we can begin to collapse some of these duplications that we've built up over many, many years.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I've been working with our CIO Council at Department of Commerce for 10 years, and traversed through many, many different personalities, several CIOs, frankly. And I'm sensing today a greater level of cooperation than it ever has been within the last 10 years. Now, I could sit here and tell you that it's all Rod Turk doing that. It's really not. What it is that we are at a transition point right now in government, I believe. And that transition point, what we're looking at then is a transition of what the CIO does at an agency or a component, and what it will do, what that CIO will do in the future. As we move more to cloud, as we move more to service-oriented types of offerings, the CIOs then are elevated to a position of actually moving more towards a mission focus, right, rather than a lower level, let me harden this server focus. It's just different. And that difference, I believe, is well respected and understood by the CIOs that I work with in the Department of Commerce. And then when you layer on top of that the relationship aspect, where you are moving the Department of Commerce, in my case, in a collective rather than as an individual component. And I think that's critical. My CIO Council, everything I do in the Department of Commerce goes through my CIO Council. And I don't do anything until I don't necessarily ask them, but I tell them, or we talk about what's going to happen. And I think that's a tremendous change in the way it's been done in the past. You know, we are a collective. We benefit from the group, if you will. Now, it's a very interesting discussion point. Just yesterday, there was an article in one of the other internet sources asking the question, somebody was asking the question, how is it that the Department of Commerce, with such a diverse set of components, because we have responsibilities from the surface of the sun to the bottom of the ocean, right? And with NOAA, and then I've got patents, I got trademarks, I got broadband with NTIA, you know, I've got trade with ITA. I mean, it is just all over the place. And the question then, this individual, who, by the way, was a former CIO at the Department of Commerce, was asking the question, how is it that this diverse set of functionalities can come together and get such a good grade in FITARA? Well, those things that I just explained to you, you know, realizing that you're at a CIO transition point, realizing that we need to do these things, and also there's external factors such as reduction in budgets, mandates to be more efficient, to consolidate, to collaborate. That's how it gets done. It gets done by bringing the team together, being aware of what is needed in terms of FITARA, but also in the broader CIO sense, and then working together as a CIO Council to make that happen. And that's why, you know, we've been consistently either at a B or a B plus. We haven't gotten to the A yet. We're working on that, but B or a B plus on the FITARA scorecard. And that's why, because of that collaborative perspective.
So it seems like there's kind of a theme going on here, which is that one of the ways to solve these examples of duplication is just to get people to talk to each other, right? So that seems like a fairly simple solution. Why is it so hard? Well,
Let me just say this. You can talk to each other, but is anybody listening? I mean, frankly, you know, that's really the issue. So let me talk about MGT for a minute, because I think this is going to be transformational as well. And let me tell you why. It's not necessarily, in my mind, the money, but it's what's going to be going on around the money that will drive some consequences, either intended or unintended. So, for example, the project selected will be required to have a multidiscipline kind of presentation to be able to define how the procurement's going to move, you know, the acquisition side, how the finances are going to be, be handled, how the technology is going to provide a benefit. And so that right there is going to drive an interdisciplinary approach across your departmental enterprise to be able to even get the money in the first place. And then at the end of the day, you have to pay the money back. It's a revolving fund, right? So therefore, what that's going to drive is projects which, back to the 24% and the 40% in terms of cost savings and reinvestment, that's going to drive you to projects where you're going to have to save money. Because if you don't save that money, that's the money that you're going to have to pay back the revolving fund. Frankly, if you don't have the money in your budget to make that legacy upgrade today, it's unlikely you have it in your budget next year or the year after, right? which means that in order to be able to make that payment back, you're going to have to save some money on that legacy system. So I think there's two consequences. I think there's going to be more disciplinary approach across the departments, but it's also going to be financially in fund savings and efficiencies driven through that process. I think that's going to be important too.
So I definitely would like to resonate as well on the whole people concept. So there's a gentleman I know at HUD, Larry Koskinen, who was a big part of the shared services migration there that happened a couple of years ago, and he really had a great quote. He said, organizations don't trust each other, people trust each other. And that's how the projects get done. It's through the trust that's built. And that's where he really began to see in the HUD transformation and in the HUD migration to shared services when things really started to lock in and get done. Because it did have some early challenges, but when the providers and the vendors and the personnel at the agency got to know each other and got to understand each other and got into that rhythm and the cycle of the project where the trust was built, through the scars and through the successes of getting that effort done, that's when things really kicked in and the project was able to be delivered. And so one of the things that I would love to see in the federal government is more and more, and on the USSM side, we look at this, to Rod's point, as helping the government understand how it can leverage as-a-service models in the delivery of its capabilities. When you're building a portfolio, what aspects of your service portfolio make sense for you to keep internally and build with your own resources and your own internal vendors, and what aspects of them make sense to go to a provider. That could be a federal provider, or quite frankly, in the next generation of shared services that we're working towards, we're going to see more and more of an industry aspect to these shared services providers, where agencies are converging on software as a service and industry types of offerings, and not just exclusively federal providers. But when we're looking at doing that, understanding, helping the federal leadership understand how they can best build that portfolio and still drive towards the same outcomes and get even better performance, and understand how to measure that performance and how to measure that cost. So if you're building your service portfolio and you're using an as-a-service offering, understanding in an apples-to-apples way what you're spending on an as-a-service version of that offering versus if you were to build it up in-house and fully accounting for that cost. And there's some constructs at play right now in the federal IT community. One of them is technology business management that folks are starting to look at as a mechanism for creating that apples to apples comparison.
I think that it's a great vision, and I want to get there. I think the challenge getting there is not just the cultural shift and the mind shift, but what do you do with all the people who previously ran those systems, operated a financial system, did these things that you might not need in the future, right? We have lots and lots of people across all of our agencies that perform functions that in that model, someone else is performing. And I think as agencies, we're going to need help flipping that switch. You then need people in your organization that are much better at, managing a service level agreement or writing a contract or documenting business requirements, much more so than some of these other capabilities that we have a lot of to build that system. But we shouldn't build a system to run HR. We shouldn't build a system to run a financial management or these other things. We have great providers that can do that, but we have people who are used to doing that. So the human resource component is really important, and I think there will be more things coming in this administration related to civil service reform or other capabilities to try and reshape workforces. But unless we do that, I don't think we can successfully get to the model that you're describing, even if we all want to get there.
You're absolutely right, Jonathan. So that's the flip side to that coin. As a federal leader, how to build the portfolio, an important part of that is understanding your people, because the people are a huge part of that equation, and understanding that they don't always have the benefit of coming to these types of events and understanding and seeing the emerging changes that are on the horizon, and helping as we go back to the agencies to work with them and understanding the change management aspect of what's coming and what their role can be, and how people do ratchet up the value chain over time in the work that's done, as whether it's the technology that starts to do the work or if it's a provider that's doing some of that transactional-based processing. Where is the opportunity in staffs day to day to continue to add value to their agencies in terms of ratcheting up that value chain, not doing as much transaction processing, perhaps doing more strategic type of work. If you work in IT, we know that There's folks that spend their time installing hard drives and SANs, driving to the data centers, optimizing disks. Well, what happens when you move to the cloud? There's still a place for them. In fact, it's a very interesting place because it still takes engineering skills to understand how to make all of that work. So it's working as a leader in building your service portfolio, but also working with the people themselves and helping them see the changes that are coming and understanding what their role is still going to be in that newer, more efficient world. So that's hugely an important part of it. Absolutely.
I wanted to open it up to the audience if there are any questions. It seems like there's one here.
Good morning. Hello, can you hear me? So I have a question. All of you are talking about modernization, engaging people. So people in the IT leadership, can you please elaborate or provide a scenario? How do you engage your stakeholders when you're trying to take on a new effort or a technology or a project?
I get up out of my chair, I walk down the hall, and I go into their office. I don't send them an email typically. The relationship building, even so, you know, it's interesting because the first thing I did right after the 20th of January, 1 minute after the 20th of January, after when Steve Cooper left, and I became the acting CIO, one of the very first things I did is go sit in the office of the folks that I'm providing services to. And you wouldn't believe how much support you get for that just by listening to your customers and getting a list of the things that they feel you're not doing for them, quite frankly. And that to me is part of the relationship building. It even goes to dealing with my CIOs. So, you know, I have a policy that if they come to me with an issue, that I respond quickly. That I get on the phone, either talk to them, send them an email, or I address it in a CIO Council meeting, and it happens like that. Because if I don't do that, I will abrogate that trust. Not only with my customers, but even with the folks in my CIO Council that I need to support me. Because frankly, I'm not the smartest guy in the world.
So I think talking about outcomes also helps to engage people. The idea of a new technology is, depending on who the person you're talking to is, be a little esoteric. But if you're talking about the outcome and maybe farmers that rely on USDA, maybe they can transact business online and spend more time farming, or a person who is interested in food safety has greater access to information, or a child on a nutrition program can register or apply for those services faster, the family can. If the outcome is what you lead with, I think people get more interested in what you're doing, as opposed to focus on, here's the new technology. Well, here's the improved outcome. And I think if we flip the conversation a little bit, it's a lot more effective.
There's one right here.
So the MGT Act seems to be in a Groundhog Day-like state. It's passed the House again unanimously or near unanimously. It awaits action in the Senate. This time through, it has a much more favorable CBO scoring, not $9 billion impact on the budget, but $500 million. But I've still heard two main questions or concerns about it raised. One, where will they place the responsibility in GSA to administer the fund? It'd be managed at OMB, but it'd be administered at GSA. Who there will have that responsibility? But the more telling point, we spend $100+ billion a year on IT in the federal government, and one can't carve out half of 1%, $500 million or more to spend on shifting the balance from O&M to DM&E. If each of you had the opportunity to testify before the Senate, how would you address those issues or questions?
I'll let you talk about the GSA thing.
So on the former question of where specifically it would be placed and managed through GSA, that's unfortunately that's not a set of information that I have to be able to answer at that time. That's unfortunately not the scope of USSM, although we are in the Office of Government-Wide Policy at GSA, with respect to other more creative mechanisms for shifting the availability of resources from O&M to DM&E. One of the things that we are considering on the USSM front is this concept of the public-private partnership, right? So we know, and public-private partnership is sometimes an overloaded word. People have different definitions for it, but we know that there is a lot of funding sometimes to make these big transitions from legacy, on-prem, highly customized systems to these software as a service, cloud-based offerings, shared services that meet a set of requirements, I think, as Mr. Tuttle had alluded to earlier, a set of requirements that a community of practice, whether it's finance or HR or somebody in mission, has developed and built solutions for. So the cost to be able to do that transition can at times be somewhat overwhelming. And so one of the things that we're exploring in the public partnership vein is, if we're moving away from a CapEx type of a model where every time we need to do these big tech refreshes with on-prem systems, and we're starting to move more towards OpEx, what's the opportunity to leverage that transition from CapEx to OpEx as also an opportunity to help address the challenges of shifting O&M funds to DM&E? And what I mean by that is, with a consumption-based model, is there a way that the vendor community can work with the federal government in terms of building in some of the cost of these transition to their ongoing pricing models? So if we move to a consumption-based model, having ways to recover that cost over time through the pricing structure.
I also think that O&M versus DM&E is the wrong way to look at it, because we have historically, everybody here is guilty of it, reported a lot of enhancements and modernizations as O&M because it's simpler and people don't look at it as, scrutinize it that way. So whatever the reported number is for O&M versus DM&E across government, my instinct and my experience tells me it's not the right, it's just not the right set of numbers. So if one, I think we have to come up with a better construct that makes it easier to report. So we can scope the problem the right way, and once we scope the problem the right way, we have a better opportunity to solve it. The MGT, there's opportunity. If I had money, you could give money to an agency, and they could be modernizing an application so it runs better in the cloud and get it out of the data center. That's where agencies don't have necessarily funds to make targeted improvements to lower long-term operational costs. We need ways to give them capital. But it's not just getting the money, it's making it important to that agency and the leadership of that agency, who has a lot of influence over how money is spent, that we should put it here because here's the longer-term benefit. And that's where I think we still have opportunity to, as CIOs, to get engaged in maybe a little lower level budget conversation.
So Alan, to your question, I found it interesting in, again, the earlier presentation that the actual percentage is 88% operational versus roughly 12% DME. I guess we benefit at Department of Commerce because our numbers are actually, I don't remember exactly, but it's our operations is actually 65 to 70%. We really have a 30 to 35% DME expenditure. So we're doing some significant development at PTO, at NOAA, and at Census Department. So we do have a little bit higher percentage there. I'm hopeful that the MGT will be, for us at the Department of Commerce, a pump primer. And what I mean by that is, if we can get some of our legacy systems, focused legacy systems, replaced and save some money, then that money then can be used to reinvest back into other investments and legacy investments, and then that will hopefully provide us with a cascading process where we can continue to save money, continue to remove legacy systems out of the organization, and can do a better job for our customers. And she's telling me to stop, so I'm stopping.
Unfortunately, we do have to wrap it up, but thank you to our panelists for being here.